Pause. Okay. So welcome everybody, and let me know if you're hearing me loud and clear. This is the second content-based lecture, but the third one, where we are looking at models of economic geography as they apply to South Africa. So in this session, we're going to be having 4 presentations, and if our schedule permits, there's supposed to be one carryover presentation from last week. That's why I suggest we go quickly into the presentations. The importance of this specific lecture is the fact that it lays a foundation to the subject of economic geography from a theoretical perspective. So I think this is where we get into questions around the model and South Africa, where we are getting presentations from a World Development report, I think. That's an open knowledge source where we are getting presentations chapter 1, 2, and 3, and then also doing the paper by Reading S of 2008 that has a review of the theoretical and empirical literature of on economic geography. Now, the Reading paper is an important paper, which I think is a paper that Tuli has to present. I would actually invite all of us to go and read it. So that we all have the same common theoretical background knowledge on subjects of economic geography. So if the people who are supposed to present is truly already in the house, no. The people who are supposed to present today, Bronwyn, you want to go first?
I don't mind going first, but my chapter follows on Vian's chapter, so maybe you should go before me.
Yes, I can also go first, Prof.
Okay, Vian.
Yeah, because I did chapter 1.
Okay, let's do it in sequence. Chapter 1, chapter 2, and then chapter 3.
Yes, that will be perfect.
You can go ahead and share your screen.
Okay, I'll do that, Prof. Okay, can you please enable the setting, Prof?
Where are you at now? Let's see. I think the setting is set.
It says,
okay. Just a minute. Yeah, I just changed it now. Okay,
perfect, yeah.
Okay, awesome.
Yeah. Okay, can everybody see clear?
There you go.
Okay, good morning everyone. My name is Vian Strydom. Today I will review the World Development Report of 2009 titled Reshaping Economic Geography. I will specifically focus on chapter 1, Economic Density. Okay, so this chapter includes the following topics: defining density, the economic world is not flat, evolving portfolio of places, measuring of density, economic concentration, historically rapid rising concentration, convergence, rural-urban disparities in well-being, first wide, then narrow. So I will review all of these topics briefly in this presentation. Okay, so this chapter starts with a short summary of the history of economic density in West Africa. So a hidden country off of the world's radar on a dusty plain in West Africa is a city of 1.6 million people. Split by the river Niger, this city has 2 halves, with each half having 800,000 people each. These 2 halves are linked with 2 bridges. The pressure of movement between these bridges are compact to full capacity, with minibuses, motorbikes, and bicycles each morning and evening. Green vans loaded with passengers transport people to residential neighborhoods as far as 20 kilometers away. This city is called Bamako in Mali. Bamako is one of the fastest growing cities in the world. Bamako's people are now moving to close surrounding neighborhoods in a search of affordable housing because the city provides to their livelihoods. So, however, in West Africa, Abidjan in Ivory Coast has twice the population of Bamako, and Lagos is even bigger. The activity in Lagos is so busy that people speak of it as living in a pressure cooker. Families in this city rent rooms to sleep for 6 hours and then hand it over to the next family. So what can be so attractive that people want to live in these cities? Despite all of the crime congestion and continuous growing immigrants, the answer is short: economic density. Lagos is one of the most economically dense cities in the world. The densiest cities are London and Dubai. No country has ever grown without their cities growing as well. As countries get richer, economic activity in towns and cities becomes denser. So important, moving to economic density is a pathway out of poverty for most people. Okay, so what? Okay, so the key research question, because I received a chapter to review, I decided to choose my own research questions. It is as follows. Why do people prefer living in economic dense cities? What does economic density do to the geographical distribution of poverty, consumption, and living standards? What is economic density? Density is a geographical compactness of economic activity or economic mass per unit of labor area. Density is composed of the level of output produced and income generated per unit of land area. Okay, so the first topic is the economic world is not flat. When considering the geographical contribution of economic activity in the world, it is uneven. Even if specific countries are considered, they are still divided by density. So you get the primary cities at the top, rural areas and agricultural cities at the bottom. In between are settlements. This figure clearly illustrates the largest cities, the rural areas, and the villages in the middle. So continuing with the economic world is not flat. For example, Belgium, the city Brussels has a land area of 161 square kilometers, of which 159 square kilometers are used for non-agricultural purposes. In this small area, a GDP of 55 billion euros is generated by 350,000 workers. This suggests that on average, a square kilometer of land has more than 2,000 workers annually producing almost 350 million worth of goods and services. Therefore, Brussels has high economic growth, high employment rates, and also a high population density. So the next concept is evolving portfolio of places. The growth of cities can be referred to as chaotic, but the various underlying patterns seem to be integrated in a specific order. This figure shows that a country is characterized by two regulations. We get the rank size rule and you get Gibrat's rule. So according to the rank size rule, the population of any city is equal to the population of the largest city divided by the rank of the city in question. Gibrat's law is a city's rate of population growth tends to be independent of its size. So cities, metropolises, towns, villages all complement each other. The primary city is the main administrative center and also the seat of policy power. The main city is also the main economic driving force in a country, providing massive amounts of goods, services, and cultural amenities. Okay, cultural amenities can be referred to as Broadway, New York, or the Opera House in Sydney. Okay, so secondary cities is a regional focus for both the society and the economy. These secondary cities are local centers for the financial sector. This serves the areas around them. Let's look at, for example, in Dallas and Atlanta, emerge as regional centers in finance and commerce in the United States. Both host regional offices of the Federal Reserve Bank. I think we can also see in South Africa, the South African Reserve Bank is located in Pretoria, next to Johannesburg. Okay, so the measurement of density. The measurement of GDP at the refined spatial scale is a difficult estimation. This is also difficult to estimate in developed countries. Output estimates tend to be only available for rather broadly subnational areas. However, as illustrated earlier in Belgium, output and population estimates are closely correlated. Reliable population estimates are more easily available. This is because a population consensus is taken every decade, and this makes the data easily available. This is easily available even in villages and townships. So this report proposes the agglomeration index computed using geographical information systems as a measure of density. This index allows for a more consistent comparison of the level of urbanization, density, and economic activity across countries. So then, continuing with the measurement of density, this index identifies an area of 1 kilometer as urban dense if it satisfies the following activity across countries. So if the population density exceeds a threshold of approximately 150 persons per square kilometer, it has access to a sizable settlement within a reasonable travel time, let's say about 60 minutes by road, and a population density of 50,000 inhabitants. So the next topic is economic concentration. The richer, the denser. So in early stages of development, an economy is primarily agricultural. People have spread out on farmlands. So industrialization brings with it a rapid process of urbanization. New cities are born and the existing expand. People crowd into the cities at a faster pace than what the boundaries are expanding. And as a result, the population and economic density increases. So two transitions that characterizes economic development is, so firstly, the transition of an agricultural economy to a much more manufacturing-oriented economy. Secondly, transitions take place at a much higher level of development. This involves the service-oriented economy. So the first phase of urbanization from rural to urban economy occurs at a fast rate, but the second phase takes place at a much slower rate. This is because high level of development is linked. Most of this transformation in different countries take place at the same time but at different rates. Okay, so globally, the top 30 countries ranked by GDP generate around 60% of the world's economic output. The top 100 cities generate 25% of the world's economic output. In 2005, Mexico City contributed 30% of Mexico's GDP, despite occupying only 0.1% of its land. The densiest places in the world are the richest. For example, London, Paris, and Singapore. These countries have generated more than $200 million in GDP per square kilometer. Okay, so the next topic is rural-urban disparities in well-being. First, wide, very narrow. So rural-urban disparities in productivity, wages, and well-being can be expected to be large and increasing in early stages of development. With the rapidly increasing concentration and economic mass in a country's towns and cities in the early stages of development, significant disparities in productivity, wage, and basic welfare occurs in urban and rural areas. Okay, so slums, divergence and convergence within cities. So in poor countries, higher average living standards in cities do not rule out poverty and deprivation. Disparities within cities can be large. For example, in Nairobi, poverty is high in the inner city, but much lower in the rest of the city. The poverty rate in general is higher outside the city boundaries than inside. Okay, so let's look at South Africa. Cape Town has a low poverty rate in the coastal areas, but a much higher poverty rate in the interior of the city. Similar to this is Johannesburg and Pretoria and Durban. They all have possible divisions, but the geography of poverty in Durban is different from that in Cape Town and Johannesburg.
Do you perhaps know why that's the case? Just on that point, just on the last slide, on that point of the geography of poverty in Durban is different from that of Cape Town and Johannesburg.
Okay, probably it matters about what production processes is, because Durban has a harbour, a lot of trading takes place. So I think Durban is the main harbour in South Africa, the largest harbour. So therefore, Durban has a harbour, and Johannesburg is more economically, more businesses, banking sectors, supply chain and all that. So I think that's the main reason, Prof.
So in a case of a town like, you say Cape Town, the poverty is concentrated in the inner city.
Yes.
Poverty be concentrated in the inner city as well?
Can you please repeat that, Prof?
I mean, for Joburg, what's your sense? Where's the concentration of the incidence of poverty?
Okay, yeah, so in Johannesburg, Prof, it's clearly in the inner city. Poverty is at a radical pace. It is because I personally come from Joburg. So when I tell people I come from Joburg, they think I live in the inner city, in the large, in the middle of the city where the poverty is high and stuff. So, but there's a lot of villages just outside the city. So poverty inside the city is more or less because the next slide will do that. It's because of slums. Slums is the government. Yeah, I will explain that because slums is more or less when the government or the society do not want to, give any money or stuff for the governments because they are illegal. So the most people living in the middle of the town and cities are mostly illegal.
Okay. Gotcha.
So yeah, I will explain it now.
Yeah, go ahead.
So the most obvious sign of division between cities is slums. Here it comes. Slums have chronically overcrowded dwellings of poor people in under-reserved areas. Okay, so the reason for this is the lack of basic public services and infrastructure, and the inability or unwillingness of many governments and urban and service providers to operate in slums, generally because the informality and illegality of such settlements. So living standards, especially health, sanitation, and security, are low inside slums than in informal settlements close by. Okay, so to conclude this presentation, the reason for people living inside economic dense cities is because economic densities provides massive amounts of job opportunities. People do not want to live on farmlands or in mining industries if they don't physically have a farm or physically is working at the farm. Otherwise, there's no job opportunities. And not only does the cities provide job opportunities, but also massive amounts of goods, services, education facilities are in excellent conditions. So yes, thank you very much for listening.
Thanks so much. I really did enjoy your presentation. What do you think? I'm sure the other presentations and the other chapters would address this question, but just as a means of thinking up front, what do you think would be the solution to the question of slums and urban poverty in the case of SA? What can be done?
So, Prophet, the problem is the illegality of these slums. So, in the interior city of South Africa, especially Johannesburg, it's horrific. It is really bad conditions. So, because it's not only South Africans, it's foreigners like Nigerians and Zimbabweans, and so they are on their own. So, basically, what the government can do is,
I mean, the question is not just to you, right? It's open to everybody to just contribute. I'm thinking, so there's a question of strengthening immigration. That's a question of, is it a service delivery question? Is it the capacity of the municipality to effectively, I mean, I'm thinking aloud. I just wanted to have a conversation around that because in the case of SA, it's a reality that would probably have to feature in one of your, either in the group assignment or something that speaks to the specificity of South Africa. It's very common here in SA, it's a pattern that you find in every city, almost in every province. So I'm just thinking, I don't know, does anybody else have a view on this before we let go, Fian?
Yeah, Prof, can you hear me?
Yes, please, go ahead.
So I've watched the news, I think it was last week. They said that our border control, they're prosecuting people that, I don't know what they did, but there was corruption or state capture that was to do there. And they were supposed to put up a like 5-meter high fence to keep out illegal immigrants. And yeah, obviously it didn't work out, and the quality of that infrastructure wasn't good enough. And so I think, like Vian said, there's a lot of Nigerians and illegal people living in our country. I think one of the things that we can do is put a better border control policy up and regulations up, so that we can control who's coming in and out and staying where in our country.
Okay, super. I just want to invite everybody else to just think about it. It looks like a favorite question for a policy assignment. Quickly,
But
let's
Dr.
apply our
Nubong,
minds to it and see if we can come up with a comprehensive response, like a matrix of the things that need to be addressed. So maybe service capacity of service delivery capacity within municipality. Obviously, immigration policy is what is coming up very strongly. That is going to address the question of the inner city. But when you expand the inner city poverty question to the question of settlements within big cities like your Alexandria and Joburg. If you go to Cape Town, your Khayelitsha, that's right next to the airport, and the disparity in the questions of development. Those are economic geographic questions that we ought to be able to apply our minds to it, to say, okay, how do you fix that? How do you solve Alexandria and Sandton sitting next to each other? Because obviously there are consequences of that in terms of crime, in terms of inequality, in terms of just the disparity of the opportunities that are offered by geographical space. Now, if you are an advisor to the government, or if you were requested to make a proposal in terms of policy to address such disparities within the various geographical settlements, how do you think we can address that? What would be the solution? Do you economically empower people? Is it entrepreneurship? Is it birth control? Population control? Do municipalities and national and provincial governments have the capacity to uplift those settlements and make them? How do you address the disparity? So it's just food for thought. I want us to have that at the back of our minds as we continue to engage on these issues. Does anybody have a quick view before we take the next presenter?
I think there's both sides to the story, because like on the one side, it's actually good for competition within the country. When there are more people from different countries, there obviously there's going to be less job opportunities, but the competition is going to be higher, and you're going to have to work harder to get the job, and I think that's a really positive point to look at. But on the other side, you can't just like flood the country with so many people, and there's not enough infrastructure and so on to maintain the amount of people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay, that sounds great. So I think that's an interesting perspective to present there. Right, so let's take the next presenter. Who wants to go next? Tuli, are you ready? Or should we go to chapter 2? Browning, is your chapter the second one?
Yes, I have chapter 2 and I'm ready.
Okay, please share your screen.
Okay.
Thanks so much. Sorry, I'm trying to find the name now.
Vian, fun, Prof.
Vian, thanks so much for that presentation. I really enjoyed listening to this, listening to your presentation.
Okay, thank you.
Browning, over to you.
Okay, can everyone see the screen? Can I start? Okay, so I got chapter 2. That's about economic distance, and it closely relates to density, and you'll hear why through the presentation. So this chapter focused on the importance that distance has to economic activity and wealth, specifically looking at North America. In the United States, there are a few areas of economic activity that's highly concentrated. On the graph, you can see they look like towers, kind of. Those are the areas with a high concentration of economic activity. And people move to these areas to live closer to the opportunity of wealth. And then in holiday times, it has been a trend in America that each year in holiday times, there's a huge move where people move back to their hometowns to be with their families for Thanksgiving and so on. So firstly, what's meant with economic distance? And that is the distance between a person and the economic activity hub of the country. So for example, in South Africa, it would be your distance between Johannesburg or Cape Town, where economic activity is high. So distance refers to the ease or difficulty for goods, services, labor, capital, information, and ideas to traverse space. It measures how easily capital flows, labor moves, goods are transported, and services are delivered between two locations. Thus, distance in this context doesn't just refer to a straight line in kilometers. It refers to time and monetary costs from one location to another. Next slide. Then the research question for this chapter, I think, is how does distance play a part in economic development? So Deng Xiaoping, he is known as the architect of China's economic resurgence, of how they grew so quickly. He insisted on openness in markets, focusing on developing the coastal areas first, and that would later overflow into the rest of the inland. Then this became the mantra for many developing countries. Their governments also decided to follow this philosophy, including South Africa, and it was referred to as spatially balanced development. Then in the USA, development was accompanied by the increase of manufacturing activity concentration in certain small areas. They experienced convergence of income over the long run, and today almost half of the population is in 5 states, but the unemployment disparities are the same since World War II. So a big thing here was the willingness to relocate. The living standards that have converged and improved in the USA is evident to their willingness to relocate to different states. But in other countries, such as Europe, countries in Europe, where the same convergence can be observed, those people were not evident to relocating to different states. In Europe, despite the different economic density in different areas, there is no monumental difference in the basic welfare in these areas. Then the main findings that I found in this chapter about economic distance is, as countries develop and integrate nationally, location matters more for economic activity, but less for social welfare. The spatial concentration of economic activity first rises and then levels off, the same as Vian found in his chapter. And then spatial disparities in living standards follow an inverted U-path, widening in the early stages of the development, remaining high for a long period and then slowly converging. The same as Vian also said, it's wide first and then narrow later. And then the last one is technological progress and globalization have increased market potential in the leading areas of developing countries, intensifying concentration and then amplifying the spatial disparities and unequalness. Then location close to markets give you a natural advantage. In the 1980s, China used tariffs and bans to reduce imports and exports over their borders. And in this time, imports from other provinces fell while the consumption within the provinces rose. This system reduced internal migration in China, so people weren't moving around as much. Most of the special interactions, such as trade, are beneficial, but they can also be harmful. As you see now with COVID, disease can be spread. Areas closer to economic density have easier access to beneficial interactions and exchanges. For example, in Indonesia with better roads, people in villages who live 60 kilometers away also have, these villages also have manufacturing activity of the same level as the district center itself. Whereas areas that are connected with bad roads or that they can't travel easily, these villages' economic activity fall drastically. And then the natural way to reduce the distance is for people to migrate. So this is what China tried to avoid. Then density in leading areas and distance in lagging areas. So subnational areas are commonly defined by administrative or political boundaries. In the instance of this chapter, leading areas are the areas that have high economic density, and lagging areas are those that have a long distance to get to them density. Thus, an area is more likely to be lagging the further away it is from the high economic density area. And then in areas, in countries such as South Africa, lagging areas are the more remote places where not even all of people's basic needs are met. And then lagging areas have higher poverty rates, but leading areas have more poor people. For example, if you compare Johannesburg with a small town in the Eastern Cape, the small town will have higher poverty rates, but Johannesburg will have more poor people. And then economic concentration in leading areas. So in about a quarter of the world's nation, half of the country's income is generated in less than 5% of the land area. That means, like in a big country like South Africa, only half of our country's income is generated in less than 5% of the surface of South Africa. And only one country in 10 has dispersed economic mass, where it's more evenly, what's the word I'm looking for, spread. Rapidly rising concentration in early stages of development, and then a leveling off, as I said earlier. And then international comparison of concentration today still supports the historical trends. So divergence, then convergence in leading areas. So for today's developed countries, spatial inequalities in income and welfare rose early, followed by a slow convergence, which is the U-shaped form of development that I referred to earlier. For developing countries, spatial disparities in living standards between subnational areas first rise and then fall with development. So some relatively close or middle income countries had income convergence, as incomes first diverged and then health and education converge with it. What's different for today's developers? Given the phenomenal size of today's global market, development relies more on pursuing an outward-oriented strategy in which leading areas compete and trade globally, not just nationally. This rapid transformation of the economic geography and the spatial disparities and inequalities in today's developing countries will likely be greater than in industrial countries during the early stages of development. Because redistributive mechanisms take time to build and mature, labor mobility and market connectivity are a bit more potent mechanisms or ways to integrate these lagging areas into national economies. Globalization and technological progress in things such as transport or communication can provide a wider range of a way to bridge this economic distance between the leading and lagging areas as well. So in a nutshell, global markets are more important, and it's important for your economy to be open and also to take into account the cost of transport and communication. And that's it.
Thank you for that presentation. Generally, can you, when you apply this analysis to the context of South Africa, do you see parallels, similarities, things that we can draw lessons from?
Yes, I think infrastructure is a big thing. When I apply that specifically to South Africa, as they said in Indonesia, they started a project where they bettered the roads for connections to the economic hub, and I think that's also a big thing in South Africa. If the roads from more remote places were better to reach places such as Johannesburg, then that would also ease the integration of the different areas in South Africa.
Okay, cool beans. Thanks so much. Are there any comments or observation from the rest of the team, the rest of the class? Comments, applicability to South Africa?
Hi, Prof. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. So I think Bronwyn's chapter and Vian's chapter can also go hand in hand as to explain why South Africa's density in rural areas that are very close to specific areas is because of the lack of public infrastructure that allows them from, say now, if you on the outer boundaries, getting to the inside is a lot or more difficult than sitting in an informal settlement or a slum or whatever. It's easier for them to sit there somewhere where their lifestyle might not be as high as in the outer parts of the city, but because they don't have access to public infrastructure or transport to get closer, that might explain or connect to one another, the two chapters.
Awesome. Bronwyn, can you take us back to that quote from Deng Xiaoping, the Chinese example? Just that slide. I wanted to see if we have if it's something that is being implemented in the case of SA.
This one.
Yes, just make it a bit big.
So his quote said, indeed, the concentration of economic activity and the convergence of living standards can happen in parallel.
Okay, I just wanted to have a brief reflection on that concentration on that and see if it's applicable in the South African context, and if yes, how so? Just open discussion. It's open for anybody to chip in. It doesn't have to be brought in. So I'm looking at the bullet point number 2, because she says bullet point number 1 says he insisted on openness in markets, focusing on developing coastal areas that would later overflow to the rest of the inland. And then this became a mantra for many governments in developing countries, including South Africa, referred to as spatially balanced development. What would be the concept, or in what way has this been applied in South Africa? What would be the concept of spatially balanced development in the context of SA? Concentration of economic activity, convergence of living standards happening in parallel. So I'm thinking this would then be applicable in the case of the context of concentration of economic activity, like in your top mining area, the whole history around the development of Johannesburg that eventually got it to be the city of gold that it is today, as an economic activity that eventually drove the growth and the development of the city as Joburg. And I think that the same will be applicable in Durban from the harbor and the concentration of touristic activities, and in Cape Town. But from the perspective of an intentional government policy, can we think of anything that has happened since 1994 that we could associate to this whole notion of spatially balanced development, or anything that is being planned at the moment that could be speaking to this reality? I have something in mind, but I want to see if you guys have been paying attention to the policy space.
Prof, isn't that the National Development 30-year policy plan, where the government is focused on choosing specific activities, economic activities, to grow economic development in certain rural areas?
True. There's that. And you remember that they have identified certain champion sectors like the green, the ocean economy, as an example, a focus on tourism and some key drivers. But from a spatial development policy perspective, do we all remember the new city that Cyril talked about that's supposed to be created in the Lanseria area? What do they call that? It's a Lanseria development hub. Did anybody follow that discussion? Okay, go check it out if you don't know what I'm talking about. There's a new development area that Cyril wants to set up in the Joburg area, and that I think that specifically speaks to this topic that Bronwyn has just tweeted. So I can't remember what speech that was. I think it's one of those speeches that he gave shortly after lockdown, because I knew he was very highly criticized around that. But just Google it and let's see what you find, and then we can have a conversation about that and its application to the subject that Bronwyn just treated. Thanks for that presentation, brilliant as the previous one. Can we get the third presentation?
Hi, Prof. That would be mine. I did chapter 3 about the vision.
Okay, you please go ahead and share your screen.
Okay. Okay, so I did, like I said, chapter 3, and that's about the vision. So firstly, what is the vision? Now, there's a difference between the borders and the divisions that separate countries. Firstly, national borders enclose people with shared characteristics, and they also provide security and stability to these people while yielding economic benefits. Divisions, on the other hand, arise when these borders are poorly managed. They can range from moderate restrictions on the flow of goods, capital, people, and ideas to more severe divisions like civil wars and conflict between countries. And countries can also, these borders can be integrated into a functional economic community, like in the case of the Czech Republic and the Slovak Republic, or they can be more divided by conflict, like in the case of Eritrea and Ethiopia. Yes, there's just a representation of the width of country borders. Like you can see in continents like Africa and Eastern Europe, and also Asia and like that, they have more thicker borders in relation to North America and Western Europe. And yeah, like the wider the border, the higher the limitations on trade, travel, and the flow of the factors of production. And like I said, economic borders are narrow in North America, Western Europe, Japan, Australia, and New Zealand, and more wider borders are present in Africa, Asia, and Eastern Europe. Latin America's borders can be labeled as in-between borders. And yeah, overall, it's clear to see, and when you look at world economies, that the wealthier countries are overall the countries with lower border restrictions. How these countries there's a few ways how they maintain these divisions. Firstly, in terms of goods and services, you can a country's openness to trade is usually measured by the sum of the imports and exports as a share of their GDP. We can also measure this openness by looking at the average tariff rates of these countries. Like I said previously, the poor countries are the countries that restrict trade more and use more tariff and non-tariff barriers. And they also face higher barriers when they export. The richer countries also face high barriers and also use tariff and non-tariff barriers, but they use it much more efficiently than the poor countries. On capital, we also can see through studies that the restrictions on capital flows are lower in industrial countries than in developing countries. And evidence from 1955 to 2004 shows that freeing capital accounts had a positive effect on the growth in both emerging and developing economies. When it comes to people, with migration flows that increase with globalization, there's a lot of potential benefits that come with it, like increased skills, more diverse people, more ideas. But there's also perceived negative effects that comes with this migration in terms of domestic labor markets, in terms of there's going to be less jobs for the local people. And this is why countries restrict migration to a certain extent and also regulate the admission of short-term visitors. Ideas are also restricted over the world, but new ideas are necessary for the transition from a low income status to a middle income status. And freedom of access to information is necessary to facilitate an atmosphere that induces innovation and productivity. And we can also see through studies and through evidence that Western countries generally have a higher degree of freedom. There's also divisions that are beyond the control of individual countries, like being land or sea locked. Land and sea locked countries usually have poor neighbors and are far away from markets. This reduces their growth by at least 0.5 percentage point. And Africa has the most landlocked countries, namely 15 out of the total 43. Country size also has an influence. Large land areas usually associated with abundant natural resources, but that does not necessarily mean economic success. A country's economic prosperity is determined by how they integrate with the rest of the world. More divisions that are beyond countries' control is like ethnic and cultural divisions. Over the world, ethnic fragmentation has a negative effect on the quality of government and economic growth, because these ethnic differences are exploited by governments to gain political power and to get control over resources. There also, especially in countries like Africa, there's a lot of conflict and territorial disputes. These divisions between countries can be aggravated when there's conflict within or between these countries, and when it involves military action, the cost for these countries can be significant. Economic concentration over the world. A quarter of the world's GDP is produced on only 0.3% of the land area. In 2006, China, Japan, and USA produced about half of the world's global GDP. This economic concentration in the Western industrialized countries and in countries like Japan has its roots in the economical and technological innovation of the 18th century. Europe's economic growth was accelerated greatly during the Industrial Revolution, and then these countries with a higher economic density excelled above others because they were able to overcome the friction of long trade distances. Like Vian and Bronnen also said, in these countries, there was first divergence, but then initially it led to convergence. So over the past 50 years, there has been a general increase in the income and basic living standards globally, but there has been some exceptions. There has been considerable divergence between the incomes of the richest and poorest countries. But in terms of health and education, there has been global convergence. There has also been income convergence in the faster growing regions over the world. When we look at geography, globalization and development, we can see that physical geography has helped some countries to become rich, but continues to hold back others. The economic geography of countries, like being able to benefit from the technological innovation of the Industrial Revolution, facilitated an agglomeration of economies and reinforced the concentration of economies. Countries within the region of regional growth centers are able to benefit from regional spillovers, and this in effect then led to new areas of economic concentration as a response to the congestion of economic activities, and also a shift that occurred from manufacturing to services, thus then creating manufacturing opportunities elsewhere for the other countries to take advantage of. In today's world, geography still plays an important role. Firstly, we can differentiate between first nature geography and second nature geography. With first nature geography, researchers have found a strong correlation between economic output and geographic characteristics. A simple regression of the output density on geographic variables captures 91% of the variance in the density of economic production. Climate also plays a huge role in agriculture, and it also interacts with other factors like diseases. Most of these economic constraints can be overcome with enough resources and if they're used correctly. In terms of second nature geography, studies show us that the initial level of capital accumulation from natural resources alone are not sufficient in explaining cross-country differences in growth and income. Total factor productivity tends to better explain this difference. Now, total factor productivity is about how efficient the factors of production are combined by the country in action. So yeah, in other words, we can say it's not about what resources a country have, but how they use and how they apply it. Also in today's, the importance of geography today, we can say that size matters a lot, because to generate scale economies, a country needs a certain population and an economic mass in place. A few countries have achieved economic prosperity by only exporting their primary commodities. Thus, manufacturing and diversification plays a key role regardless of geographic features. More open borders helps a lot, but a mature economy is necessary for this. Landlocked countries overall benefit the most from being open and being integrated with the rest of the world. Okay, what is different for today's developers? Firstly, the scale and the speed of economic integration in recent decades have been unprecedented. There has also been an unprecedented fragmentation of production processes. Production tends to be regionally concentrated, but this may be a threat and opportunity for smaller countries. The threat is that smaller countries with a poorer infrastructure and low skills will not be able to compete in global markets. The opportunity is that this spatial concentration remains beneficial for production because it increases specialization and scale economies within these subsectors. Lastly, countries can improve their economic fortunes through changing their neighborhoods. They can do this by overcoming barriers between them and other countries and thinning their borders. And yeah, that is what I have for the vision.
Brilliant stuff. I want to engage you on two of the slides. The last slide, the one that you just finished. I want us to have a conversation around countries changing their economic opportunities. Your last bullet point, how do you see us applying that in the context of SA?
Okay, Prof, in the context of SA, I would firstly say, I think the problem is that in Africa, we are too quick to think that we have to go to the rest of the world to economic integrate and to improve our economic fortunes. Right. I think if we just, like Dewald also mentioned earlier, if we improve our border controls and monitor the people that come into South Africa and go out. I don't think the problem is necessarily with the people like the Nigerians or Zimbabweans or whatever from other countries in Africa that are working in South Africa. I think the problem lies in the regulation of that and the amount of illegal immigrants that we have. So I think if we firstly improve our border control, then we can benefit a lot from other African countries by working together rather than being more or less against them.
Right. Okay. So I think the immigration question is cross-cutting, and it has far-reaching implications, and there is no question in that needs to be strengthened. But again, you see that there is this balancing of act that needs to be established. For example, point number one: the scale and speed of economic integration in recent decades have been unprecedented. So there is a move driven at the level of the WTO that wants to reduce barriers to trade. In a classical, fully integrated economic context, you are looking at freedom of movement of capital and freedom of movement of labor across borders and the elimination of all manners of barriers of trade. Obviously, it needs to proceed sequentially, and countries need to build capacity. So we find ourselves with this kind of catch-22 situation where we want to open up the economy, we want to be able to integrate trade with the rest of the world. At the same time, opening up the borders or poor border management causes an influx of migrants that put a pressure on the social infrastructure, social and welfare infrastructure of the economy, which has an impact on inequality and has an impact on growth. So it then becomes, it places us in a difficult space where we need to balance off between policy alternatives. South Africa sits with the, and related to the presentation that what you have now presented, South Africa sits with a situation where it has a market of about, let's say, 56 million people, which is not very big when you compare to other geographically concentrated regions of the world. So it stands to benefit from regional integration. But regional integration means the collectivization of economic space. Your bullet point number 2, an unprecedented fragmentation of production processes. The fragmentation of production processes essentially mean that production from the cradle to the grave no longer occurs in single location. So fragmentation of production processes is unbundling of production processes. Put differently or spoken in English, the laptop that I'm using, the keyboard can be manufactured in South Africa, the screen can be manufactured in Swaziland, the motherboard of the computer could be manufactured in Botswana, the charger could be manufactured in Lesotho for the sake of the argument. Now, if each of these countries, for the sake of the argument, develop capacity, say in the production of keyboards or screens or chargers, and so on and so forth, so then the SADC region or SACU region or the South African region can then develop capacity to produce laptops at globally competitive market prices without a single country having to accumulate the technical know-how to manufacture every component of the laptop. Now you can take this analogy to cars, washing machines, consumer goods, capital goods that facilitate production process, and robotics and goods that have a higher technology intensity. And now, for that to happen, there needs to be collectivization of planning. We need to be able to grow together, in a sense, you know, like what happens in the European Union, which is made up of about 27 odd countries that have certain levels of development that is shared. So production fragmentation can take place in the EU because they have a collective advanced level of development. So you see that because they are all developed at a certain level of technology intensity, all at a certain level of advancement, then the question of migration no longer becomes a huge concern, because a German moving to the Netherlands to go and get work in the IT or in the tech industry is not perceived as a transfer of skills, or the German economy draining the Dutch economy. Now, South Africa sits with the difficult, delicate situation of being a slightly more advanced economic unit that needs to now plan its development surrounded within the sub-region and the continent with regions and countries that are not at an equivalent level of development. So it needs to integrate to have larger markets. It needs to pursue collective upliftment of sorts, but at the same time, deal with its domestic issues. So those are the classical kinds of space and density and location questions where you want to say you want to expand, where your bullet point 3 says production tends to be regionally concentrated. This may be a threat for smaller countries. Like I'm saying, if you concentrate production regionally, in the case of South Africa, in Southern Africa, you're going to find your other countries, your Botswana, Swaziland, Lesotho's of the world, that think if we do that, then South Africa is going to take advantage of the fact the South African economy is going to dominate the production because it has a stronger industrial base. So the other countries will resist that. But it will be the same countries at the same time that will place pressure on South Africa to say, open up your borders because we will need to be regionally integrated. So the opportunities that spatial concentration remains beneficial for production, increasing specialization and skills economy, these are now theoretical constructs. They are ideals to say that if we are having shared capacity, each country in the region is committed to advance and develop its knowledge base. Each country in the region is committed to upskill the quality of labor and to uphold certain standards of governance that would not make their population want to run away across the border. Then we can now have collective markets, shared standards that make economies of scale and full integration to be beneficial. Then we can be talking about in the SADC region of an economy of 200 odd million people. That is also a buying power, that is also a regional force that will develop in other aspects than just South Africa. So there are not easy, straightforward answers to these issues, especially from the policy perspective. You have a series of conflicting priorities that have to be considered against the backdrop of real domestic challenges in each of the countries. Domestic challenges of poverty and inequality, domestic challenges of governance, a collapsing economy in the case of Zimbabwe, domestic challenges of crime in the case of SA. So it's often a policy challenge to find the balance between these realities as we want to articulate them. I don't know if any of you has a view or an observation on this that you want to throw in there.
Hi, Prof.
Yes.
As you were saying with like the European Union, with the barriers or that the regional co-integration, I think South Africa is because of our infrastructure and just the way that our country is set up. If you go to the European Union, if you drive for 3 hours, you can go into 4 or 5 different countries. But if you drive for 3 hours in South Africa, you're still in the same province. So it's a difficult thing to, as you say, knowing that economic density and regional co-integration is important. But as you say, finding a policy that works in our specific situation is always going to be not as easy as saying, oh, we should be like the European Union, because it's you've got to take into account the differences in infrastructure and geography and where we lie and who our neighbors are. So it's a difficult thing. There's a lot of factors to take into consideration.
Absolutely. I do agree with you. Any other comments? Right. There was one presentation that carried. Thank you so much, Luan, for that presentation. I also did enjoy it thoroughly. There was one presentation that carried over from last week. I'm not sure if the gentleman is here.
Was that Yuan or not, Doc? I don't see him. I don't think him and Edgar were last week, but I don't think either of them are here. By the looks of it.
Okay. And unfortunately, Tuli is not able to connect today. She just sent me a message saying she's having some challenges. So I would want to request that we bring this specific session to a close and anticipate having a longer session maybe next week, if that's okay with everybody.
100%.
100%
Okay.
off.
Okay, thank you so much for the team that presented today. I really did enjoy it. I am going to upload it on YouTube and share the link so that those who could not attend for today can also benefit. I think you guys set a really good standard and precedent for the presentations moving forward. I apologize, I promised to share an updated presentation list, which I have not yet done. I asked one of my PhD students to do the distribution, and he didn't quite understand it. So what he reworked, I could not share it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to work on it myself and share it. But the team for next week, Carl and your team, you already know what you're supposed to be presenting on.
Yes, we're from chapters 4 to 8.
Absolutely. Okay, so that sounds good. I think let's take it up from next week, and I'm still consulting with the other campus since we need to set the assignments together. And once I have more information on that, once we have agreed and made up our minds, then we're going to come back to you with a definite response as to what the assignment is going to be. But I think we still have a bit of time. We're still good to go. I think we still have all of October and November, so we're still good for time.
Awesome.
Okay, thanks so much, guys, and have a fabulous day.
Yeah.
Thanks, though.
Bye.
Okay, bye-bye.
Thanks, Doug. Have a nice day.
Bye.